Good evening, everybody. I see there's still some folks signing on, but we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Dick Milius. I'm chair of the board of Alaska Common Ground, and I want to welcome you to tonight's exploration of the Jenga game of education funding in Alaska. We begin tonight by acknowledging that we call in from around the state, and many of us are on the traditional lands of Alaska Native peoples, including the Dena'ina Athabascans here in Anchorage, where I am tonight. We honor the enduring connection of Native communities to this land and offer our gratitude to the land and its people, past, present, and future. Alaska Common Ground was founded in 1991 by a group of Alaskans passionate about fostering civil dialogue around public policy issues. Our mission is to engage and inform Alaskans to cultivate understanding and cooperation on issues important to Alaska, and we believe an engaged democracy thrives when Alaskans from all backgrounds are empowered to make informed decisions on public policy issues. We do this primarily through events like this one, and we're glad you've joined us tonight. The purpose of tonight's program is to delve into how education is funded in Alaska. It is a complex system, and as we all know, education funding remains a significant policy issue ongoing into the upcoming legislative session. We hope tonight's discussion leaves you with a better understanding of the mechanisms that fund education, how they work, and how they interact, so that you can be more informed as you engage on this important issue. Tonight's event is a Zoom webinar. We'll start with an overview of education funding and then move to addressing questions submitted by registrants ahead of time, along with common questions education leaders hear in their communities. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, not into the chat. Again, into the Q&A feature. If time allows, we will answer some of these questions as well. The event will run until 7 p.m. and is being recorded in case you or your friends want to watch it later. It will be available on the Alaska Common Ground website and our YouTube channel. Alaska Common Ground could not conduct the work we do without the support of our members and donors. We are funded almost entirely by individual gifts from Alaskans like you and are committed to keeping our events free and open to the public. If you would like to support events like this, please consider becoming a member or making a donation online at akcommonground.org. Putting these events together takes time and vision. Before introducing our moderator, I want to thank Alaska Common Ground board member Lika McCauley, who led the work group that organized this event, and thank Jess Braunlatch, Alaska Common Ground's program coordinator, who served both as a work group member and set up, publicized, and is running this Zoom session. Now I'd like to introduce Brendan Wilson, our moderator for tonight's discussion, who will introduce our panelists. Brendan Wilson taught instrumental and vocal music in Wisconsin, Colorado, and Anchorage for 17 years before moving into school administration. He served as a school-based administrator for 16 years in Anchorage before coaching principals to implement positive behavioral interventions and supports, as well as integrating mental health clinicians. Brendan is currently providing leadership for dual roles within the Alaska Council of School Administrators, an organization that provides leadership and advocacy for Alaska public education. He is the Alaska Association of Secondary School Principals Director, as well as the coordinator of the Alaska School Leadership Academy program, which provides support for early career principals across Alaska. Thank you, Brendan, for joining us tonight and moderating tonight's event.
Thank you, Dick, and thank you to Alaska Common Ground for hosting this panel tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists from across the state. Dr. Madeline Aguilard is the superintendent of the Cuspic School District, where she has led 9 remote schools in Western Alaska since 2022, focusing on instructional improvement, professional learning, and culturally responsive practices. Since starting with the district in 2019, she has become a strong advocate for equitable funding, rural education policy, and international teacher recruitment. Her leadership reflects both innovation and collaboration, highlighted by spearheading the Cuspic Empowers initiative focused on teacher clarity, collective efficacy, and trauma-engaged practices. Dr. Aguilar holds an EDD in Educational Leadership from Lamar University, and her commitment to shared responsibility and equity has earned her significant recognition, including being named the 2025 Educator of the Year by Peak to Peak. Frank Hauser serves as the superintendent of the Juneau School District. With 28 years of experience as an educator in Alaska's public schools, he has worked in nearly every type of school setting, from music teacher to principal to district leader. Guided by the question, what's best for kids, Superintendent Hauser believes in collaborative leadership, open communication, and a focus on students. He serves on the AASA governing board and on the board of the Southeast Regional Resources Center. Superintendent Hauser is a strong advocate for Alaska students and has provided invited testimony to House and Senate standing committees. He is also a proud graduate of the Mat-Su School District and the University of Alaska system. And Andy Ratliff is currently the Chief Financial Officer for the Anchorage School District. He has been with the district for 19 years, starting as an accountant and working in various finance positions until becoming CFO nearly 3 years ago. Andy moved up to Alaska in 2003 from rural Oklahoma and has 2 children in ASD and 1 graduate with his lovely wife, Monica. When he's not making spreadsheets or PowerPoints to explain the spreadsheets, which you'll see one in just a minute, he enjoys hiking and biking with his family and working on and riding his motorcycle. So I want to welcome all 3 panelists. Thank you for your time. I know you are all very busy, especially as we are just starting to get into school budgeting season. So we're going to start with Andy. Andy's going to give us a quick overview of how schools are funded in Alaska. Andy.
All right, thank you. I probably should have done some work on my bio and read theirs first. But anyway, I'll go over, again, my name's Andy Ralph. I'm the CFO for the Anchorage School District, and I'm going to go over some of the funding components of education in Alaska. So really, as we talk about the Jenga pieces, the Alaska K-12 funding sources are separated into the 3 pots of state, local, and federal funds. Within the state funding is where most districts get the bulk of their money, probably all of them. Most of that's coming through the foundation formula funding, and we'll go through how that's calculated in a little more detail in a few more slides. We also get some one-time funding from the state in lieu of foundation funding, and then we have on behalf retirement contributions. So if you look at a district's financial statements or their budgets, you'll see these things called on behalf retirement contributions from the state. For Anchorage, it's generally about in the $40 or $50 million range. The districts don't see that money. We just record it as a revenue and an expenditure, and that's to shore up the unfunded retirement pension system in Alaska. We also sometimes get other state grants, and then we get money for transportation. Sometimes we'll get major maintenance grants depending on how the legislative session shakes out, and then we'll get bond debt and reimbursement sometimes as well. Up until 2015, the state would provide 60 to 70% reimbursement for bond debt, so that the district went and approved bonds to their voters and sold those bonds. The state would reimburse 60 or 70% of those. That stopped in 2015. They had about a 10-year moratorium on it that's coming back at a 50% and 40% rates for reimbursement. But even with those moratoriums, they're still have bond debt on some of the old bonds or some of the old bonds that were approved before 2015. And even in kind of those lean years with the state, they didn't fund all of that bond debt reimbursement, and that went to the municipalities to pick up the cost as well, or the districts, depending on how it was organized. Local funding, the majority of Anchorage's property get it from property taxes. In Alaska, we're separated between municipal and borough districts and REAAs that don't really have the property tax base. So the city borough districts have the local property taxes. And I'll go over some of how that's calculated, because there's a couple different components to it with a required local contribution and then additional allowable. We also receive in smaller amounts interest earnings, user fees, such as if you have parking or sports fees. Local grants, we get some local grants for preschool from our municipality. There's other entities that will donate to the districts as well. Again, not a significant amount of dollars. And then some districts get in-kind contributions. And that would be if a district has their municipality pay for utilities for their buildings. If they maintain and pay the utilities, and that have to be counted as the in-kind contribution that they record in lieu of getting cash from them. On the federal side, we get federal impact aid. That's a program that is really to offset costs of providing education on non-taxable federal lands. So for Anchorage, we get most of our impact aid money from JBER, the Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. So all the students that live on JBER, we get a portion of money from them, or from the feds to offset that. It's kind of a payment in lieu of taxes. Other districts like REAs, and we'll get it for, I think, tribal lands. So and we'll get it on like other federal connected properties, like if a parent works at the FBI building or something, there's a small amount we get. And then the state will take back some of that impact aid when they do the foundation formula. And we'll kind of go through that, how that works as well. We get some money from E-rate. That's a reimbursement program on communications. So data and telecoms, the federal government will pay for part of that. I think it's really more prevalent particularly in districts with really high cost of broadband. So they're getting quite a bit of money back from that, but the cost to administer the program is really high as well. We get title grants, like Title I is for economically disadvantaged, and we get there's a whole like slew of title grants from special ed, migrant education, child in transition, professional development grants. Those are another things that that's one of the things that we talk about, these Jenga pieces, as some of those grants got pulled from districts this summer. I think in beginning of July, the Fed said, we're not going to pay, or we're not going to reimburse these certain grants. For Anchorage, is about $14 million worth. They ultimately ended up reversing that decision and providing the money back to the districts. But I think kind of long term, what the plan would be, it's about $6 billion tied up in a certain section of the federal grants at the federal level, nationwide. And they want to condense that. The plan was to condense that to about $2 billion and distribute it as more of a block grant style. We don't know where that's going to head, but that's kind of what they've signaled. And it could mean some significant changes in funding for districts. There are a number of federal competitive grants we can get, just a whole slew of those, depending on where you can find them and what you qualify for. But we've gotten several of those over the years to help offset or institute some new things that you want to try at districts, or improvements that you want to make. Districts get some money for Medicaid reimbursement. So if we provide medical or Medicaid eligible services to students there, we'll get some reimbursement if we apply through the state. We get federal money for food service programs through the National Food, or I forget the name of it. There's a national reimbursement program for food service. That goes with the free and reduced meals. And then they also have some grants through there. Some districts get forest receipts. I don't know a whole lot about that. Anchorage doesn't get those. And they also get broadband assistance grants, or BAG grants. Again, Anchorage doesn't really qualify for those because we have high-speed internet, but a lot of the districts in Alaska really don't. So that's really kind of the intention of those BAG grants. So this is really the big, or probably not all-inclusive list of how districts get their money, but there's a lot of different sources. And when one of them changes, then you either have to stop providing that service or find a new way to pay for it. So next, just want to briefly talk through the state foundation formula and how that turns your students into money, essentially. So this is for Anchorage. This is what we budgeted for FY26, and it's a 6-step formula that turns what your student count is, or average daily membership, or ADM is what we call it, into dollars. So we start out with just the brick and mortar kids in the schools, so about 39,821, and it ends up going through step 6, which gets to about 71,000 adjusted ADM. And I'll go through these in a little more detail so you can see the calculation. But really, the school size adjustment is intended to provide economies of scale. So it should cost less per student to operate a school that's larger than a small school. So that's really what this does is the bigger the school, the less money you get per student. So for Anchorage, it's almost a 13% aggregate adjustment. Some of the schools we get like a 0.934, some of them we get a 1.5 or 1.6, but the aggregate's about a 1.3. So that makes our ADM, our brick and mortar schools, not our correspondence, just the ones that are in buildings, of 39,800, gets up to about 45,000. And then within there, there's also some hold harmless clauses. If a school district were to lose 5% or more of their ADM over the course of a year, then there's a hold harmless provision in statute that funds, gets some of that money back and steps down that loss over the next 5 years. So here's how that school size adjustment kind of looks in a graphical form. The top section is the school size table that is in the deed documentation. And then if you were to graph that out, that's what it looks like at the bottom. So you can see when those schools have, 50 or 100 students, that adjustment is much higher than if they have 800 or 900. A little over 1,000 is where that break-even point is. So I think it's 1,022 students, you get a 1.0 adjustment. And anything less than that, you get a somewhere less than a 1.0. That's kind of something we've been talked about. Is they talk about changing that the correspondence adjustment to put that in the beginning of the formula at a 1.0, which if they did that, then we would get more money for correspondence students than we would for students at any of our schools that have over 1,000 students. So that's one thing we're paying attention to, is any changes in that, but that's really the graphical representation of the school size. The next item, there's a district cost factor. So Anchorage is the base. We get a 1.0 cost factor, and this is really to adjust for cost of living differences in different communities. The original data for this was done back in, I believe, around 2000 is when they pulled the cost data. They implemented it over the period of years from 2008 to 2012, and then it stayed like that since then. So really, we're operating on these district cost factors that were developed over 25 years ago to fund education. So when you hear people talking about we need to update that cost of living or cost factor, that's really what this is. Here's a list of all the cost factors in the state. I'll leave it up for a few minutes, but you can see Anchorage is the one, and then everyone else kind of on top gets something above that. Back in 2000, it probably was the cheapest to live in Anchorage. But I don't know. I think they probably need to update the study to figure out what the new ones are. Fairbanks and Matsu are the next closest with a 7% adjustment on top of that. But some of them get to about two times that, like Yukon Flats, you can see 2.11. So really, that's one of the next adjustment that we do on the foundation formula. Step 3, there's a 20% special needs factor. And this is kind of administered as a block grant style funding, is really what it's intended to do. And it's for like English language learners, gifted education, special education, vocational education. The state doesn't really give us a breakdown of how that 20% really has to be spent. It's just they say we're providing this extra 20%, you guys need to provide these services. So that increases the adjusted ADM to about 54,000. And then on top of that, they add a CTE factor, which is about 1.5% of the previously adjusted number to get up to about 55,000. Again, that's to provide that career technical education, but it's not something that we're required to report out on or technically spend in any specific way. But again, it's just to provide, the state says, here's the money, I'll provide a career technical education program. And then for intensive needs students, and there's probably people on here that can better describe what makes an intensive needs student or makes a student intensive needs. They require like a 3-to-1 student to staff ratio, a number of related services, and special busing. But their Anchorage has a little over 1,100 of those students that qualify that, and to pay for the funding, the education for these, they have a 13 times multiplier. So that 13 times the 1,100 students comes to about 14,560 intensive need adjustment, which gets added into that total adjusted average daily membership number. And then lastly, they add in correspondence funding at a 0.9. So we take our correspondence count, multiply that by 0.9, and add that to the total adjusted ADM. So that total adjusted ADM for Anchorage goes from about, it was about 41,000 students, including for correspondence and brick and mortar, and that gets adjusted up to about 71,000 in total adjusted ADM. So that total adjusted ADM number is really what's going to drive the state funding. So walking down the rest of the calculation for how the state turns those adjusted ADM into dollars, that's where the base student allocation comes into play, is that a district adjusted ADM times the base student allocation gets what they call basic need. For some districts, that's where it stops. Districts that just have other impact aid or required local or city borough districts have adjustments made to them. The first one is required local effort, which is 2.65 mils of the property values. So at $48 billion in property values in Anchorage, we get about $128 million taken off that the city's required to fund, and that comes out of state funding. There's also a reduction for federal impact aid. So the state will reduce federal impact aid up to 90% of what districts receive from their state funding because they pass what's called a disparity test, and the federal government allows them to deduct this money from the state funding. And I got another slide on this, so we'll get into that a little bit more on these two deductions. Then lastly, they provide so that gets down from about 474 million of actual basic need to about 340 million that the state's going to pay for. There's another 1.1 million in state quality schools grant, which is $16 per adjusted ADM. On the local side, we have to pay the locals have to pay the 127 million for the required local effort, and then they can pay up to 23% of basic need in quality schools. So that's called the additional allowable contribution above what that required local effort is, and it's capped at 23% because that's because of that disparity test, trying to keep the range of like a 25% funding between the highest and lowest funding districts. And again, we'll talk about that later. But for Anchorage, a lot of times, one of the issues we see is like the timing on this. So we request our taxes in February and March from our assembly, but we don't know what the state cap is going to be, because the state caps are the amount of money, so does our local government. But when the state caps it, we don't take any more that the local government could give us, because we don't know how much the state's going to give us. We always kind of err on the side of caution there and take the lower end, so we don't have to overtax our citizens in Anchorage. Like this year, we didn't know how much funding we were going to get until August. So we didn't know what that number was going to be. So we went at the rate that was in statute at the time. So our total local contribution ends up being about 225 million. Kind of the backdrop, here's the base student allocation number from FY17 on to 27, and that orange line above represents the inflation, what the inflation-proofed BSA would have been, or had it been inflation-proof since 2011. And that came from a report that the legislature finance had done for the legislature to determine what that number would be. So we wanted to show it here against what the actual BSA is. So you can see in 25, we had like the BSA was 5,960, and we got $680 of one-time funds. That's in the lighter blue bars. The orange bars are our district fund balance. So that's how we supported the budget in FY26. In FY26, while we did get that $700 base student allocation increase permanent, really it was only like 0.3% more than what we'd actually received in FY25. So we really had to take into account those inflationary adjustments to our district to help cover those deficits. And generally, our inflationary adjustments come from contracts or labor contracts, where about 87% of our general fund money goes into wages and benefits. So, when we provide increases for our teachers or any of our staff, that's really what drives our inflationary pressures. For the local property taxes, looking out for FY27 for Anchorage, and this is kind of an example of, who pays. So that Jenga game of, who funds the education. For FY27, our property taxes are going to go up by about 5.7% in Anchorage. And so our required local contribution goes up by 7.3 million. And our state foundation revenue is going to go down by that exact same amount. And really, so we get the question a lot, why do my property taxes keep going up and the school district still needs more money? Well, this really is why, is because that required local contribution continues to go up. And every time that does, the state pays us less money and the district is kind of break even. So then when we have inflationary pressures for the contracts or any other utilities, insurance, whatever's going up at the time, that's where you have to have, where you talk about, that's what the amount you have to cut is. So kind of takeaway over the last decade or so, that required local contributions gone up by over 31 million, and offset by the state by the same amount. So that they've only, if everything goes according to what's in statute now, it'd be about a 1% increase from state funding from 17 to 27. So that's really, that's kind of the backdrop on the local funding, and try to answer the question of why do our taxes keep going up, but you guys still need more money. And this is exactly why. Over the course of that 10 years from 17 to 27, the cumulative amount that Anchorage taxpayers have put in is about 121 million above what it would have been if it had just stayed flat. So that's the local deduction, and the federal impact aid deduction is the other money that the state reduces based on someone else providing money to the district. If they pass the disparity test, the state can reduce the funding, and it's based on the revenue per ADM of the districts between the 95th and 5th percentiles must be within 25% of each other. And that's kind of where we get to that 23% additional local funding limitation. Right now, the state has failed the disparity test for FY26, and they're currently appealing it. I really haven't heard any updates for a few months on that, but hopefully they'll be able to address that soon, because it ends up being about an $80 million problem for the state. The other thing that was kind of changing was local contributions. If you were tracking that back in, I guess it would have been last June, the Department of Education introduced some changes to limit how much local contributions we could take. And that was going to affect funds that were kind of outside of what our general fund was, like our transportation funding. We get additional money for that to help provide transportation services to our students, and pre-K for Anchorage is about $15 million in total. And then there was some other language in there that was really vague, so we didn't really know what was going to happen with local contributions that might be in kind, or if it wasn't even provided by the contribution or city or borough, because they took some of that language out. So the state did pull that back in October. They're going to go try to look at the language again and rewrite it, make it a little more clear. It's my understanding, but we'll just have to wait and see where that shakes out. Some of the questions that came up is, where does Anchorage spend our money? And really at a high level, here's kind of the graphic of that. The direct classroom instruction, that's everyone sitting in front of teachers, or the teachers and paraprofessionals sitting in front of students on a daily basis. All the supplies, materials, equipment that goes along with that. Operations and maintenance, just keep our buildings clean and open. And then student supports encompass a whole lot of things, including like a lot of the special education, counselors, nurses, librarians, security. I put student activities in there, but it's curriculum development, the cost of clerical staff and principals at schools, instructional supervision. So all these things that help make a school run and students successful. And then administration, you can see the list. That's kind of the general back end of the school district, school board, superintendent, all the finance and operational departments. But over the years, Anchorage spends about 5.3% of its money on that administration, and it continues to, be a challenge to staff this given the current climate. With that, I have provided some links to the presentation too. A lot of this is explained in the School Finance on Deeds website, and then a link to the FY26 ASD budget. If you go to that ASD budget link, there's also a link to something called Balancing Act that we've done. It's a software that allows us to put in our revenue and projected expenditures for next year, and allow folks to go in and try to balance their budget themselves, and then submit that to kind of gauge priorities about where our community stands on where our funding should be spent or where cuts should be made if they're necessary. Then I provided some contact information if anyone has any follow-up questions. That's my presentation.
Thank you, Andy. That is a lot of complicated calculations to share in just 15 minutes. So I encourage people to check out those resources to dive a little bit deeper. Frank, Andy just gave us a really nice description of how we fund our schools. Let's shrink down from school level into the classroom. What funds a classroom?
Oh, thanks, Brendan. I appreciate it. And thanks, Andy. I always appreciate watching your presentations. I am Frank Hauser. I'm the superintendent of the Juneau School District. So I think as we step back and we think about what funds a classroom, obviously the first thing people think of are your teachers. You want to have a good, high quality educator, teacher teaching our kids and making sure our students have the best support from instruction. The materials, of course, in the classroom, there's funds that are needed to provide materials and curriculum. Most classrooms, will have some other supports in place, maybe paraeducators that are coming in and supporting students, interventionists. And then also, you have to think about, you have specials, music, art, library. These are, additional courses that kind of support the classroom and support that instruction on top. But I think it's important as we think about a classroom that there's a lot more. And I think you saw that on Andy's slides. A lot goes into the running of a school district and running of a school to make that classroom instruction for those individual students in that classroom successful. I mean, I often will say that it doesn't matter if you're a teacher, if you're a paraeducator, if you're the superintendent, the lunch lady, or if you're the superintendent. Every single person that works in a school is instrumental to the success of the students. And I think that's where you kind of have to look at it when you talk about like what funds a classroom. I think all of a system funds a classroom. And sometimes people will say, schools aren't business, but businesses. But in a lot of ways, they are businesses in that we have to have an HR department to do staffing, recruitment, and hiring. We have to have maintenance and facilities and operations to make sure that our facilities are in good working order. So when students come to the school and when staff come to school, they have a great learning space to learn in and explore in their school day. And then we have payroll. We have to make sure that we're able to pay and provide benefits for people. And so it's oftentimes when we think about it, because we all went to school, most of us, went to a public school, we all remember being in the classroom and the great experiences we have with our teachers. But it's so much more that goes into a classroom and what needs to happen to fund a classroom. It really is the large system, which is why it's important to think, the classroom is where the magic happens, where that instruction takes place. But it's important to think like for that to happen, all these other systems that really, I would say, are really off stage. Your teachers are on stage. They're the ones that are there every single day. You see them and they're instrumental to that work, and the paraeducators and the principals. But when you look at for the system to truly be successful and to work to benefit all students, it really is the whole system and all the other supports that enable that classroom, and all those classrooms and those teachers and those staff that work to educate those students are in place for that success of those students.
Thanks, Frank. Madeline or Andy, did you want to add anything?
I think he summed it up. Thank you, Frank.
Great. Well, then, Madeline, Frank just talked about the various costs that go into a classroom, from materials to the people. I often hear this said on media or in social media that Alaska pays more per student than anywhere else. Is that true?
So, I mean, to answer your question, if you look at the dollars and the numbers, I would say yes, but there's a whole set of reasons behind what's funding that. And, so as the superintendent for Cuspec, we are out on the YK Delta. It costs quite a bit to live here, work here, run a school district. And for us, though, one of the pieces that's really important to look at are those rising fixed costs. And when you talk about how much it costs per pupil, I mean, there are pieces that the district has control of, and there's pieces that a district doesn't have control of. For example, I'll give you one that really is kind of mind-blowing, our property insurance. So if you look at Cuspec's property insurance from 2017 until 2025, it has increased by almost 180%. And that's our buildings, our assets. We've made the news, what condition our buildings are in, but yet we're paying an increase of almost 180%. So when you go to talk about per pupil funding, it's more even like Frank was saying, it's more than a student and a desk. Like you have to have those operational pieces. And sometimes those are completely out of a district's control, and you have to provide them. Even fuel, our fuel price per gallon in that same time span has increased by almost 90%. We have to have fuel to keep our buildings warm. So I would say yes, but I mean, there are some things that no matter where you cut and how you slice it, you can't reduce those costs.
Thank you. Frank or Andy, do you want to add anything?
I think the one thing I'd add, and Dr. Aguilar, I think highlighted it, is these fixed costs that are outside of the control of districts. They're just the cost, utilities costs, insurance costs. They continue to go up, and so sometimes we hear the talk about, we're not cutting education funding; it's flat funded. But reality is, the rest of the world, inflation continues to go up. So a flat funding, those dollar amounts, like you saw on Andy's slides, don't actually go as far as they did the year before or 10 years before. And so, as those other fixed costs that districts have no control over, but yet are essential and in most cases required by law or we have to have in place, those costs continue to go up. Districts are obligated to cover those costs. And to cover those costs, that's money that's coming straight out of the operating fund and really coming out of the classroom and our ability to hire more, teachers, more paraeducators, support staff, all those pieces come back and really impact the classroom, when you look at the system as a whole.
Yeah, and I would add, I mean, even talking about fixed costs, though, we have the fixed costs associated with our employees. If we want to keep the same number of employees per student or same classroom ratios, we have health insurance increasing 10 or 15% a year, far surpassing the amount of inflationary increases that we have. So just to provide these health insurance at the same levels that we did before, we either have to cut our benefits or cut people to pay for them.
Yeah, you all talked about fixed costs and the stress those can put on a budget. Madeline, what are some other stressors on budgets?
So I would go out on a limb and say the out migration, the declining enrollment. And I'll speak from our region specifically, in the YK Delta, we actually have a growing, a positive total birth rate in the region, but when young adults and families leave faster than than children are born, that ADM is going to end up declining. But I would even say, though, that honestly, the school district contributes to that in the current state. When you have a budget crisis, such as what we have fewer staff, we have fewer programs, we have aging infrastructure, we have reduced educational opportunities, specifically CTE opportunities. So we're not graduating plumbers, we're not graduating electricians, we're not graduating mechanics, we're not graduating people that can contribute to their communities and support their communities. And so that contributes to families moving away. And then it's a cycle. Once families move and your student enrollment starts to decrease, your ADM decreases. And so then your funding further decreases and you have to continue to make cuts and you continue to cut programs. And so it really is, I mean, when we can't provide those services, we are really doing a disservice to our communities because they're not going to be able to sustain themselves.
Yeah, thank you. Frank, Andy, any other stressors?
Well, I think one of the things, and I'm sure this might come up later, and it's something that we're all dealing with, is our facilities. We're in aging facilities too, and they're not just in schools, but state buildings, the infrastructure. Those facilities are getting older. Upkeep costs continue to increase, and there's limited funding. And again, those goes to the system and all the pieces that need to be in place to ensure a safe, welcoming, and positive environment for students. And that also is the physical building that your students and staff are entering in. And I think it's important to realize that a lot of stressors too are aging facilities. And without bond debt reimbursement, I think is a great example of this. The state has had bond debt reimbursement where a bond will go out, and if approved, the state will reimburse at a certain percentage. There was there was a hiatus on that for a number of years. That just sunsetted, but yet there's no funding behind that. And so while bond debt reimbursement might be a possibility, there's no capital improvement funds, or very limited for the need out there across the state for the number of districts and schools that need some facility repairs. That is a stressor, as well as just the facility costs. And, Madeline,
I'll chime in and
you
say
can speak better to
absolutely.
that than probably anyone else, on this panel. I mean, you have worked through that. I mean, that is a very significant, not only cost to the districts, but also cost to our students' instruction and our staff.
Staff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to turn over to you, Madeline, to talk that one, because I know you know.
No, I absolutely agree. I think many people that are on here have heard me testify about this. And just even the morale of staff. And if you can't retain teachers, I mean, if they're in a building that is condemned, or they've spent their whole 17 years running around chasing, buckets to catch water, and they go to leave, you have to, I mean, it costs a lot of money to replace them if you can even find someone. And, you heard my introduction, part of what I have been advocating for is international hiring. And I'll just say, there is a cost to trying to recruit and retain teachers, but at the same time, if there is no applicant pool, like, the cost even grows even more. And as far as now, we're also having to front the cost of visas. And so it just is a continual cycle. I know you went from building maintenance, but that's one of the biggest things, let alone student safety. I mean, we all know that it takes a safe building to educate children. But just specifically staff, I mean, that's one of the biggest things that for our turnover, being able to have a comfortable place to work, teach, and live.
Yeah, and I would add even to that the job security. We see every, we do our budget in February, and the staffing generally across the nation is done around, March, April. So if you want to get good candidates and know who you're going to take, then you need to have a budget set. But if we don't know until August how much money we're going to get, are we even able to spend that money on the teachers if any are available? So that's one of the struggles we have, is with that staff morale, and that turnover is exacerbated by us telling people they're going to have a job, and telling them, no, maybe not have a job. Well, wait, we're going to give you a job. By that time, they've found other employment, and I think that really does a disservice to our children as well.
Well, and really fast, if I can just tap into, Andy, what you were saying too, and Madeline, I think it's important as we talk about stressors on budgets, but there's also the stressors on the instruction to our students. And I think it's important to really keep that in mind. I mean, we look at this, how do we provide the supports for our students, and the uncertainty around staffing, the timing of when the budget finally gets to districts and you can actually know what your budget's going to be, creates an unpredictable situation that causes staff turnover in a lot of instances. And we talk about stressors, the cost to onboard new staff, not only the amount of time it takes for new educators to get up to speed and become more veteran, experienced educators. Having started 28 years ago my career, I remember my first couple of years teaching, and I'm a much better educator now than I was then, because those are experiences that you continue to learn. But I think it's important that those are stressors that oftentimes we don't realize, and the cost to onboard new staff. I mean, one of the last numbers I was hearing was over $20,000 every time you hire a new teacher to bring them up to speed in a district. I mean, those are all, it's not just one or two things. It's a multitude of pieces that just continue to stress the systems.
Thanks for that great discussion on that. We're going to move now to some questions that were provided in advance by our registrants. And I want to thank those of you who registered ahead of time and gave us these questions. The first one, we're going to start with you, Andy. What ancillary funding is changed when the BSA, the base student allocation changes? So that just happened recently. And I think specifically, what percentage of funding goes to classrooms versus administration?
I did have that chart that shows, what percentage overall goes to administration or classroom support, ops and maintenance. So it was about 5%, and the rest is those other categories for administration. But kind of that underlying change is when that base student allocation goes up, and if it's permanent and districts can plan for it, then their municipalities are able to increase that additional local contribution. So if I get $10 million more through a BSA funds, you can get 23% of that on top of it for your local. If you're up to the cap, and that's about 2.3 million extra. So that's really kind of the additional change. But knowing about it in advance is, at least for Anchorage, one thing that is really important for us. We're also limited how much we can grow in any given year we have a local tax cap. So some years, like this coming year, if all our money that's within our local tax cap has to go to pay for that required local contribution, then there's not going to be much they can put towards the additional local contribution, even if that cap goes up. As far as getting, like when we got the new state money this year, I think there's some documentation that we have on our website too that shows that all that money ended up going back to the classroom. We still ended up cutting like 130 or 140 positions, 15 or $18 million, but we restored by and large most of the classroom positions through that. We still increased our PTR as well. But all that money went back to providing those supports for our teachers and classes.
Frank and Madeline, do you know what the breakdown is for your districts?
In the Juneau School District, when we look at just some of those costs, I mean, for example, the salary and benefits is 90% of the Juneau School District's budget. And so when we look at, I mean, we're in the people business, we educate kids. And I think that's really important to realize. And I know in many districts that has shifted, and that number is continuing to going up as costs continue to increase and funding remains relatively flat. We, of course, and I do want to take this moment to thank the legislature for the work in getting the BSA passed. I mean, that has really been a game changer for districts this year. So we appreciate that, but yet there's still that continued cost. So in the Juneau School District, 90% is salary and benefits, and that really is our staff.
And I'll just chime in. So on ours, the direct instruction and that student support, as Andy broke down, we're looking at about 75% of our budget is completely devoted to that. And specifically, we have quite a high student support budget, but we also have quite a high, our students have quite a bit of needs as well. And so like Andy described, we provide special services, related services, our special ed teachers, our students with intensive needs, they have instructional aides that are with them during the day. And that piece is a big part of our budget. And those are not only the right thing to do, but those are required. There's no way to maneuver that, and there should not be. But with that piece, that's a big driver. I mean, that's what's driving our budget. Those direct instruction and that student support.
Madeline, you mentioned special education, and I noticed this question was in the Q&A as well as submitted ahead of time. What are you thinking about addressing the lapses in federal funding with this dismantling of the Office of Special Education Programs? And please feel free to go into the other programs that have been impacted as well, CTE, whatever you like. Let's start with you, Frank.
Oh, well, I can jump in, and then Madeline to jump in too. I guess as we're looking at the Department of Education, and of course the potential of the downsizing Department of Education, the impact with title funds. Some of what we've been hearing in some of the direction, of course, is looking at title funds and the support for special education. It's important to note, especially if we talk about special education, IDEA, when it was originally adopted and passed into law, was set up to fund 40% of special education costs for districts. The highest I believe that ever went to was about 18%, and it has been around 11% reimbursement. In the Juneau School District, we spend multiple $1 million more for the cost for special education to support our special education students. And like Madeline said, it's required by law, but it also is the right thing to do to support our students and make sure that they have the supports to find success in the classroom. Um, but what's interesting is when we talk about federal funds and that federal funds potentially changing and shifting and maybe not as much federal funds coming to the districts. There's been talks about moving what Andy talked about, title funds, Title I, Title II-A, migrant education funds, and shifting those, what are really formula driven, specific identified funds that support a targeted reason, let's say, because they vary depending on the title fund. As those title funds kind of potentially shift and conversations go around block funding, some of those targeted funds potentially could go away, and it's just the state gets a certain amount of money to be used on everything. And of course, there's some concerns there in tying it back to special education. Districts have a requirement to have what's called maintenance of effort. So we spend a certain amount every year for special education that aligns with special education. A district can't just say we're going to stop spending on special education. There's a requirement to maintain a maintenance of effort. And as that funding from the federal government shifts and drops or potentially goes away, it could have an impact on the district's amount of funding to go towards maintenance of effort, which means districts are still required to provide that level of maintenance of effort, but yet now the other funds to support that are maybe not there. And so that funding comes directly out of the general operating fund, which are funds that could be used for other areas or were used maybe the year before for other areas that we know are good for kids, electives, student activities or sports. I mean, just there's a lot of different factors that come into play, and those federal funds are so essential to a lot of the specialized supports that we provide for students. With the fear of those going away, it's really it causes a lot of anxiety and concern, not only for building administrators, teacher staff, but I know families too.
I'll
Matt?
try and piggyback off of that. That was a pretty robust answer. But for us, that is a big concern. That is, we sit down and we really look at our maintenance of effort every year. And given that, a single shift with our budget, we are much smaller than Juneau and Anchorage. The loss of, say, for example, a special ed director, which was my role before superintendent, that was not replaced, and I am still the special ed director, that can shift, a whole piece of that maintenance of effort. And so you have to really be cognizant and aware when you're making those budgeting considerations and when the board is approving a budget that you are maintaining that effort because if not, it's going to cost you even more money to pay back. And so that's going to be the piece that, especially for us, and as our budget is super tight already, it's going to come at the cost of things like curriculum. We went a whole decade without adopting a social studies curriculum, and then we got lucky enough to adopt a small portion of one this year, but I guarantee that it's going to be another whole decade before we get a math curriculum or an ELA curriculum. That's going to be the trickle effect because there's only so many ways to slice it, and you have to maintain that.
I'm going to go off script for a minute and take a moment of privilege and ask a question that just popped into my head. When the two of you were talking about those federal dollars, and Frank, you mentioned block grants. Are any of the three of you excited about the idea of the State Department of Education managing block grants? And I'll break a cardinal rule and answer my own question. When I was a principal, and I've shared this with our congressional delegation. One of the places where I thought the federal government was actually very efficient was getting Title I dollars from the federal government to my school. And I'm just wondering, do you agree with me? Are you worried about efficiency there?
I'll jump in. I am, and even just looking at our current State Department, they're facing cuts as well. I mean, they're not staffed even like they used to be. And so I'm really concerned on how we're going as a state to manage that. I mean, we don't have enough people even at the state level to be able to do that in a timely, reliable manner, in my opinion. And so that is something that I am concerned about. And I do agree with you, Brendan. I another hat I wear is federal programs. Surprise. So that is one thing that I follow closely, and I would agree that that is, kind of a well-oiled machine at this point, as far as reimbursements and processing those. And I am not excited about that being changed up, I'd say.
And I support everything that was said, and I would add to one of the conversations when they talk about that potential shift from federal or title kind of formula grants to block grants. Part of that conversation is, but the block grants you can spend on, the state can kind of hand out and you can spend on anything. There's less federal oversight and requirements for how those funds are spent, which I think in a lot of ways that oversight in saying that these funds must be targeted specifically towards high need students, towards migrant education, towards professional development to help our teachers and our support staff and our administrators be better educators. I think that's really important. But the other piece that I think causes me concern is the shift, which we're hearing is, and these are not exact numbers, these are just example numbers, but, there's $4 billion going towards title funds across the nation, let's say, an example. The conversation they're talking about with block funds now is, yeah, you can spend the money, but you're only going to get a quarter of it, $1 billion it's going out. So the flexibility, okay, I guess I could see where there could be some benefit to flexibility, but at the same time, if flexibility comes at the loss of, 3/4 of the funding that you would have received before, I would take the additional needed funding any day of the week with the additional targeted formula grants of how that funding is going to be spent to meet student needs. And at the end of the day, we are here to meet student needs. And I think that's, in my mind, the focus and some of the concerns that I have with that shift if it does come down from a formula-based, title funds to just block grants.
Let's stay at the federal level for just another minute. Andy, you mentioned impact aid money in your presentation. How is that money determined? How much money should a district expect to get for payment in lieu of taxes for military families?
Preface this with I don't really know how much other districts get, if there's a different sort of adjustment for that, but for all there's 3 military installations in Alaska that receive funding, one in Kodiak, one in Anchorage, one in Fairbanks. So those are the 3 districts that get the funding for it. The state prepares an application on our half based on, I think it's an aggregate local revenue per student or local expense per student, ends up being about $9,800 per kid. And then there's like a average daily attendance so it's decremented by maybe like 8% from there. So they take that $9,800, multiply it by 92 point something percent, and then that gets the per student amount. And then just however many students are living on each military installation is multiply that by the funding is kind of the simple formula for it.
Can I jump in real quick and add one other component of impact aid? So specifically also it is goes towards districts that have tribal lands, no tax base on those lands. And so for us, it's a big portion of our budget. I'd say roughly about half of what the state even pays in the foundation formula that we receive on top of the state funding. And so without that, there's definitely no way we would be able to function. But that being said, even that half piece, as I don't remember if it was Andy or Frank earlier, but that's not the full amount that our lands technically would be eligible to receive. And so just to be pointed out, Alaska is the only state in the country that still funds and still runs impact aid this way. And I will say it right now, and I know there's the flip side to this coin, but if Cussbuck received their full impact aid dollars, we would be pretty close to being whole. Like that would be a key piece in solving the problem for Cussbuck and districts like Cussbuck. We are an REAA, and so that is the key piece. Again, there's a total flip side on what it's going to cost to backfill that 80 million. But if you want to talk about making districts whole, and that would help.
Thank you. Let's get back into state funding. Frank, there was a question submitted about homeschool funding. So what's the impact of homeschool funding and adjusted ADMs, which Andy said stood for average daily membership, for both correspondence and charter schools and carryover funds?
Oh, well, so I mean, as we talk about, there's a lot there. So, okay, let's see. I'm going to start with, Andy talked about in his presentation, the ADM and how it goes through the steps, the multipliers or the factors. And he talked about correspondence schools and the correspondence factor, which is a 0.9. So for every student that we have in the correspondence program, we get 90%, though they count towards 90% of that ultimate ADM, or what becomes the adjusted average daily membership when it goes to the final calculation for the amount of basic need districts receive. That 0.9 is for those homeschool students. Charter schools, it's a little bit different. It's all kind of that school size. Charter schools actually get a higher multiplier. They get I think it's if they're over 75, they get a multiplier of 1.45. So that's a little bit higher. And if they drop below 75, then that could drop down to 1.18. So there's a lot of those school size factors are really important. And as you heard when Andy was talking about the school size factor and the different multipliers, as the school size gets bigger or really more students are enrolled in the school, that multiplier drops and gets lower because of believed economies of scale. A larger school, I used to be the principal at Service High School. We had about 1,700 students. The multiplier for every single one of my students at Service High School, the multiplier was, I think, like 0.84. And so that size of the school, those students generated small for the economy of scale. There's been conversations at the state level looking at the homeschool and the multiplier for homeschool going from a 0.9 to a 1.0, like Andy said. What's interesting is that homeschool, that correspondence, let's say, in homeschool program through the districts would go up to a 1.0, but some of the justification of why large schools have a reduction for economies of scale or larger facilities that have less overall need, I would come back and there becomes a disparity between if you have a homeschool program or a correspondence program that doesn't actually have or limited, if you will, brick and mortar, a building costs, but yet we go from a 0.9 to a 1.0, then where's the justification for a brick and mortar school that does still have those overhead dropping below a 1.0? And so I would say that, as a school district, we have a homeschool program in the Juneau School District. We have about 275 students enrolled in our homeschool program. I love being able to have a homeschool option for my families. It provides great choice, firm believer in choice. We've got a charter school. I love having choice for families and families being able to choose what learning environment they believe is going to work best for their students. But I come back and I say, when we look at supports and what the needs are, if we bump up the correspondence from 0.9 to 1.0, or I should say, if the legislature considers that, then I would say we need to make the baseline for all students 1.0 and start building from that point forward. So the smaller schools get more, but that base for all students, including correspondence, that multiplier is a 1.0. Because I think that goes to also addressing some of the other costs that we kind of tied into it earlier in some of our conversations. It would help support some of those factors as well. And so those are just a couple of my thoughts. I'm sure Andy or Madeline have some thoughts on that. But I mean, it's an interesting conversation about the multiplier for correspondence and kind of our homeschool programs increasing and where I see the need potentially for all students, including our correspondence programs, to see that increase.
Yeah, and I can go ahead and discuss that second part of that question about the carryover. So within the correspondence schools and the state statutes is a requirement that districts will hold over any unspent student allotment. So as long as that student stays enrolled if they're going from 9th grade to 10th grade, if they have $1,000 left over their allotment, the district's required to reserve that amount and provide it to the student until they either graduate or leave the district or leave the school. So that's a required amount that our correspondence programs can carry over. We allow in Anchorage, and it's probably not this way statewide, but in Anchorage, we allow our charter schools to reserve any funds that they have unspent and carry those forward. So if they didn't spend, 500,000 of their state generated funds or state and local generated funds for that year, then they get to pull that money forward into future years. And we really did that mostly as a result of most of those folks were in like leased facilities and trying to help them get a more permanent home. So allow them to build those reserves up to help fund a future facility.
Thanks. Is there anything else, Andy, in statute about requirements for the budget? I mean, I'm thinking about my time as a principal. I was never a charter school principal, and I didn't get to carry unspent funds over. What happens to that money?
Generally, if we don't spend funds as a district-wide, we pool those back up into district-wide resources, and it's called fund balance or savings. This year, Anchorage is spending about 50 million of our savings, pretty much the last of it, to help not have to make additional cuts on top of the 130 folks that we already reduced. So we're spending that 50 million. Next year, we don't have that available. And that's kind of where you talk about we have this, even with the kind of historic $700 BSA increase, we also have about a $700 BSA equivalent that we're using in savings just to shore up operations along with some cuts. So as we look forward to next year and we have a $77 million deficit, it really becomes that amount we spent in savings plus our inflationary pressures from our contracts. But for the carryover, we are limited by state statute of how much we can carry over. During the COVID years, they waived this 10% limit. So the 10% limit was a certain category of unreserved fund balance divided into your total expenditures for the year. So if we spent $600 million in a year, we could carry over $60 million of what they called unreserved fund balance. Part of that with Anchorage has a little nuance with that too, where about 25 million of that would be tied up into a bond rating reserve that the city requires. Since Anchorage is the only district that requires that, it's not really in statute and it's considered unreserved, even though the district can't spend it. So in that scenario, the district would have, if we spent 600 million, we could carry over maybe 35 million total in unreserved fund balance.
And if I can kind of piggyback on kind of the fund balance conversation, I think it's important to note. I mean, fund balance has come up a few times over the last few years in conversations. There is a limited statute of 10%. In the Juneau School District, we actually have in board policies a lower limit of 1.5%. The board can't spend down and must maintain at least 1.5% fund balance moving forward. And there's a reason for that. Having a fund balance, and I've heard sometimes, people criticize districts for having a fund balance. Fund balance is a way to help districts kind of, if there's an emergency. I know a number of years ago, there was, a school that burned down in the Anchorage School District. This is many, many years ago when I was first starting out. But I mean, emergencies happened. We had, something happened in the Juneau School District where, it requires, whether it's a roof leak that requires an immediate outpouring of cash to cover some damage or any issues that come up. I mean, that fund balance is essential to be able for districts to be able to have access to funds to make emergency repairs or if something comes up, as well as many districts maintain and have grants. Grants, you don't get forward funded money for grants in most cases. A lot of times grants are reimbursed quarterly. And so if we have staff on grants that for that whole quarter or before we can put in a request for the reimbursement, the district has to have the funds to pay for the insurance and for the salary for those individuals that are working on the grant. And that requires that there be, if you will, some money in the savings account to cover some of that. And so fund balance is important to be able to help districts weather any emergencies and maintain that kind of level of stability throughout the year as revenues coming in, but expenses are continuing to be charged and spent throughout the school year. And so fund balance is really a necessity and is needed. And it's interesting in the Juneau School District, we, to go to Andy's point, we're also using about 7.7% of our fund balance from last school year to fund this year's budget to help weather that, what really is funding that is not maintaining at the level of what the increases are. And so we are using fund balance to balance our budget, like you said, in about 7.7%. And that fund balance is one-time funds. Once it's spent, you don't have that money anymore. And so it's really challenging as we look to the future and as education funding does not keep up with inflation or remains, flat for a number of years, and then we get, one-time infusions, or we get a BSA increase once every, meaningful BSA increase once every 10 years. That ability to have a fund balance is so important to kind of weather that, if districts can even have a fund balance, because once it gets spent down, then there's no more money available. And that's the concern a lot of districts are having, the importance of having fund balance, but the necessity of districts to spend their fund balance to maintain similar at or slightly less service and opportunities for kids in their districts.
Thank you. Andy, we had a question in the Q&A. Could you run through the numbers one more time for charters? The example here's for example, 1.45 above 75 students. And then also, can charters qualify for Title I funding?
Yeah, charters can qualify for Title I funding if they have the economically disadvantaged students to support that. I believe we have one charter school in our district that does receive Title I funding, an Alaska Native cultural charter school. For the funding piece of it, generally that school size adjustment for brick and mortar charter schools acts the same as district schools. And it's at that 150 mark where you start getting about 150, you get about a 1.45 school size adjustment. So if a charter school goes below 1.45 or 150 students, they get that 1.45 adjustment down to, I think, 75, and then it goes to that lower rate if they drop below 75, and that's to encourage them to have a minimum number of students there.
Thanks. Frank, I just got a text from someone asking me to specifically ask you to expand a little bit more on local contribution.
Local contribution. Well, this goes back to, there's so much to talk about. I mean, some of what Andy talked about, some of what Madeline talked about. I will say the Juneau School District, we get zero impact aid. So when we talk about local contribution, tied to that is impact aid and what really is the term maximum local contribution. And so Madeline talked about the impact aid funding that Cuthbert School District would receive. The state of Alaska has an equalized foundation formula. And part of that is, as was said, the state of Alaska is the last state that has the disparity test, which you probably read in the news, equalized foundation formula. And how's that? And you saw that on one of Andy's slides. That disparity test is really looking at the percentage difference between the 95th percentile district and the 5th percentile district is the cost per student or per ADM. That 25%, if it exceeds 25%, then the disparity test kind of fails. And so a lot of the conversations around impact aid and the cost for impact aid and the impact that the state is able to keep 90% of the impact aid funding from the federal government to go towards essentially helping to fund public education in the state of Alaska, which, like Madeline Cuthbert School District, that's that 90% of their impact aid, which is federal funding to offset non-taxable lands, goes to the state, not directly to her district. And so when you think of that piece and then local contribution as part of the impact aid and the Staying within that disparity test, there's that cap of what is considered that maximum local contribution for free public education, which is laid out in federal code. That local contribution for organized boroughs and municipalities like Anchorage and Juneau, REAA districts like Madeline's district, they don't have local contribution. All their funding comes from the state. Whereas in organized boroughs and municipalities, that funding is shared. There's a certain portion that comes from the state, and then the boroughs has a minimum required local contribution and can contribute up to a maximum. The disparity test and the language around impact aid and the equalized foundation formula actually limits what that maximum local contribution can be. And so it's boy, I don't think we have the hours that it would take to go into all the nuances around local contribution and the impact, but it's interesting how those pieces all connect and how maximum local contribution, the contribution that we receive, use Anchorage as an example and the same example in the Juneau School District. We receive non-educational funding and non-instructional funds outside that maximum local contribution from our borough or an Anchorage from the municipality that goes towards transportation, because transportation costs continue to go up, but yet the funding for it is enrollment driven. But in Juneau, if I lose 100 students, I lose 100 students towards that multiplier for transportation, but I still have to run all the routes because I didn't lose 100 students in one subdivision. They're around the state or around the city and around the borough. So that is really important to realize that non-instructional funds that fall outside of local contribution are really important to support other services, and they're targeted funds. They're not used for just general education. They're usually targeted for transportation, student activities. We have a Learn to Swim program that, our city gives a certain amount of money to help us support teaching our students how to swim, which, being a swimmer and living in Alaska most of my life, we have more coastal waters than anywhere else in the United States and really the nation combined. It's so important, especially for our coastal communities, that we have those opportunities. And that is money outside that local contribution that could be threatened with that regulation change around redefining the definition of local contribution to in-kind services, which Andy talked about. And like I said, I don't have enough hours to go into a lot of details on that, so I'm going to stop right there, but appreciate the question.
I'll offer one final comment on impact aid and local contributions. And my opinion, we have to raise the floor. We can't lower the ceiling. I mean, that's what it boils down to split the disparity.
Andy, you have an ASD specific question in the Q&A. What impact is statewide correspondence schools, so not the in-district programs, but the statewide ones, having on ASD student enrollment? And do you know how many students you are losing funding to other school districts who are offering statewide homeschooling programs?
Yeah, I don't know what the student count is that resides in the municipality of Anchorage that is not going to Anchorage schools. I think there's at least a few thousand that are choosing statewide correspondence and private schools, but we don't necessarily have data on who's not there. But it does continue to increase. That's anecdotally, those programs do continue to increase. Even correspondence schools within our own district, they continue to increase as well. So there's kind of a shift towards that style of learning as you get more and more pressures on those brick and mortar buildings and continued budget cuts.
Thanks. And I don't see any reason why I shouldn't invite Frank and Madeline to respond to that as well.
Well, and I will just add, we do have in the Juneau School District, in the Juneau area, we have some students that are statewide correspondence programs. And even our Homebridge programs, the statewide correspondence programs, we have students from across the state. But what I will say is, in districts like the Juneau School District, those correspondence students that are statewide correspondence students, that funding goes to that correspondence program and that district that runs that correspondence program. But we have a number of students in the Juneau School District that are non-Juneau School District students, but are participating in sports, that are coming in and utilizing some resources. And so there's still an obligation to many districts to provide some services or opportunities, even though there's very limited or even in some cases no funding that's going to supporting that. And so I think it's an interesting piece. I think people need to realize that, those student funding go to another district, but the local district still provides some services and opportunities for those students that reside in that district's zone.
And I'll respond quickly because my answer would take us down a whole different path. Because I can probably count on both hands how many correspondence students we have in our district. Our parents, our families, school choice is brick and mortar. And it's not because there aren't other choices, it's because that's their choice. And so different answer, different question, but I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you. We're going to end with one more question that was pre-submitted, and I'll ask you each to respond to it. What is your assessment, and since we're talking about school financing tonight, let's consider the financial impact of the state responding to the typhoon disaster on the western side of Alaska. How has that impacted your districts, and what's your assessment so far of the response?
I'll jump in. So Anchorage was the receiving district for a lot of the students that came in. I think we've enrolled about 170 new students from Western Alaska as they come in and go to the mass shelters. And right now, I think they've actually demobilized all the mass shelters and got them into more in hotels or more kind of privatized stuff. But really, our support started as soon as they started coming in because we had the logistics settled to be able to provide transportation from the evacuation flights on J-Bear over to get them to the relief shelters. Trying to get the students enrolled. We've had folks going over to those mass shelters every day, providing supplies, backpacks, try to get these kids what they need to come into Anchorage schools because it's, a huge shift for these students. They're coming into a school that is a lot of them coming into a school that's twice as big as their entire communities. So it's just a dramatic shift. They're going to need a lot of supports, and we're trying to, keep those students and families together to keep that continuity for them as best we can. We're working with the Department of Education about how to provide funding and how to provide these services. DEED's been really supportive of this effort as well, and working with the State Emergency Operations Center and FEMA at this point to try to identify what costs we can be at least reimbursed for on those, and going after some grants to help serve the students and provide some of those resources as well.
Well, and I guess I would just go in. My heart goes out to the families and students impacted by this. I have to say, I think the response, even though for the size of Alaska being the largest state in the nation, it's amazing how tight knit the Alaskans can be and the support that they provide each other, and really education in Alaska. The superintendents are a really close knit group, and districts communicate a lot. And Anchorage School District stepping in, Dr. Bryant, Andy, and the work that all the staff in ASD to help support the families and students and the districts impacted. But I think all of us, we've had the opportunity to meet, multiple times as superintendents, and we're all just however we can support. And I do have to say, I think the response from DEED, making sure that as they're looking at the funding support, supporting the districts that were impacted, but also realizing that the Anchorage School District and districts that receive students, that were displaced and families as a result of the typhoon. I think it's really important that, and appreciate the state's response to make sure that that funding is able to be there to support the districts, to support the families and the students too, because it's can't even imagine just what some of these families are feeling. And like I said, my heart goes out to them and those educators that are there supporting their students and their families. It's just, like I said, for a large state, we're really a pretty close knit state and really, really do care a lot. And I just proud of Alaska every single day.
No, I'll echo that for sure. So those are our neighbors. And I've been on many of the calls and so have others, and it's just been from an educational standpoint, just to see the State Department, and then for the districts, the superintendents, and the superintendents affected, I would go and say absolutely agree with what Andy and Frank have said, and I'll say a big thank you to Anchorage, and then also there's other districts across the state that took students as well and families, and they stepped right up, made sure, and there are laws in place for when that happens too, and those districts, to my knowledge, they've completely done what's been asked of them and what that standard is, and so I think it's been, educationally speaking, a really proactive response.
Thank you all for everything you're doing to support those students and families that were so impacted. Um, We are at time. I'm hoping that Dick will give me 30 seconds to just ask if there's anything that any one of the three of you didn't get a chance to say that you'd like to say really quickly, or any wrap-up remarks.
I guess I would, Joe, and thank you for providing the opportunity. It's been great. It's been great being on a panel with all of you, Madeline, Andy, Brendan, and I just want to thank the attendees that came in to learn more and to be engaged in public education, specifically public education and funding in Alaska. So it's complex, it's challenging, but I appreciate everyone's wanting to be here to learn more and to be actively involved in the process. So thank you, and I appreciate having the opportunity.
Yes, thank you. Really appreciate it as well. And to the attendees and those that watch the recording later, if you have rural questions, rural remote questions, I am definitely more than willing to talk about things. Or if you have ideas, give me a ring. So thank you for listening.
Yeah, just echo what they said. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and help, get some clarity out there on how districts are funded in Alaska and some of the challenges we face. It's going to be a pretty important year this year, I think.
Thank you all for spending time with us tonight. We know your time is really valuable, and I learned every time I hear about this topic, I learn something else. So I really appreciate your different perspectives.
Well, my name is Lika, and I just want to shout out a thank you to Brendan Wilson. Thank you so much for facilitating tonight's evening discussion. And we also want to give a big thank you to our panelists, Andy Ratliff, Frank Hauser, and Madeline Aguilard. I also want to take a moment to thank the members of our ad hoc working group with the Alaska Common Ground that included Jess Bronlick, Stephanie Nichols, Cami Dalton, Alex Jorgensen, and Kevin Voss. So as we share appreciation, Jess Bronlick additionally helped organize lots of the logistical pieces of this Zoom and lots of work we do at the Alaska Common Ground. So we know if we were in person, we would be having applause. So I'm just going to take a moment to pause so we can imagine all the applause that goes for all of the people that are helping with this work. And I want to echo, like our panelists and our moderator, thank you to the attendees for coming and staying engaged. We do want to follow up with sending out some information, just to kind of, share some facts, share our slides, things like that. We're really looking forward to providing another similar event in January. It would be great to reconnect on things that we didn't get to. It's a complex topic, as well as an after action review. You heard a lot tonight about the delay in knowing how much funding was coming or the delay of release of some of the state and federal funds. And so this is an opportunity where we want to be able to talk about how that did impact districts when the money came, but it came at an unpredictable time. If you're not an Alaska Common Ground member, please consider going to our website at akcommonground.org and checking us out, considering joining or making a donation. We do our work to support a more informed and engaged Alaska democracy. We'll get a recording later, but thank you again for coming and just understanding, learning more about the complexities of education funding. We really use that analogy of the Jenga because there's lots of different parts and pieces, and much like the game, sometimes we're holding our breath, hoping the tower doesn't collapse with one little piece. We hope you have a nice evening, and we thank you so much for attending.